Well, welcome everybody. Slightly different format this time. This is a new episode of the Art Business Podcast. My name's David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the Master's Degree in Art Business at the Sotheby's Institute of Art, London, which you can see is writ large on the wall behind us. That's where we are in Bedford Square in London. And my guests today well, I'm just going to introduce them one by one. So Joanna Shepard, Jo Shepard, is director at Joanna Shepard Conservation Limited and specialises in the conservation of contemporary art.
Hi,
Welcome.
David.
And Claire Fry is a preventive conservation consultant and filming conservator at Spencer and Fry Limited, specialising in heritage conservation. So obviously the theme this week is conservation, but I've invited both Jo and Claire because we've got these two angles perhaps on the conservation of heritage, if you like, and the conservation of contemporary art. They overlap and differ, as I hope we will find out during the course of the conversation. So starting with Claire, can you tell us, Claire, how you first maybe became interested in art and then its conservation, and maybe what interests you working with older art, as we might call it. Actually, often my students call it dead art, much to the detriment of classicists like me, and heritage.
Okay, so growing up, I loved history, really interested in history, and my parents used to probably drag my sisters around National Trust houses, but I used to go quite willingly. I remember there was a certain one on Coton Court where they had planned the gunpowder plot and they'd sign the window, and you could still see this. And I just had this moment of they were here in this room and it's still like this. And all the artifacts and the objects were there, and thinking this is incredible. So I loved history, but was very strong on maths and science when I was at school. So I didn't think there would be a sort of career that would fit. But I was very, very lucky because I did some work experience at Bristol City Museum. I thought I wanted to be a curator. And on a Friday, the curator was ill, so I spent the day in the conservation lab, and that was it. That was just, I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Well, they asked me to pick some glue off an ancient Egyptian stone, and I just thought, this is a job, how amazing.
It's so very romantic on one level, it does. Yeah. Like the Egyptian stone statue is very romantic and archaeological and Indiana Jonesy, dare I say it,
yeah.
With the new film now launched.
Yeah.
Can't wait to see it, I guess. But picking the glue off is, I guess this is kind of the nature of conservation, isn't it? You're working with very sort of amazing stuff, but sometimes you're working with kind of enemies of that material.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's thinking probably about materials. So sometimes you're working on something and you have to remember that it's actually a really interesting object, but you sort of just thinking of it in materials and the way that those materials react and how they've been prevented conservation, how they can deteriorate. So so you do get quite logical about it, don't you? And every so often you just have a wow, this is incredible.
And the education qualifications listeners would be interested in. What kind of education qualifications were kind of required for you to then achieve a career goal to be a professional conservator?
So I spoke to universities, and at the time when I went to study, the main courses were at Cardiff University and UCL. So I contacted them and they said I had to have a chemistry A-level. So I studied chemistry, then did a degree in archaeological conservation. So went in through that route, and then a postgrad in care collections, internship at the National Trust. And then, that's a few years at English Heritage, and then Spencer and Fry. So that's how I got into it. So
internships, even then, if I may say so, were very, I mean, it seems to be kind of quite a modern word, internship, with my students, but it's something that has always been important, to get experience and put it on your CV.
It's very difficult in conservation to get a job without experience and to get experience without a job. So internships are great because it was paid, and I worked with some amazing people at the National Trust who were, Sarah Stanford, Linda Bullock, who were incredible conservators. So it was, for me, it was a really great way of getting into that world. So and
maybe we could talk. I might come back to you, Claire, to explain to our international listeners about what the National Trust, basically what it is. So we might come back to that later on. So Jo, can you tell us about your early experience of the art world and your path to becoming a conservator, this time of contemporary art?
Sure. It was I was always fascinated by drawing and painting from a really early age and loved art at school. But quite quickly I was persuaded to go down the academic route, and the general consensus was, oh, you'll never get a job, pick your best subject at college. And so I started with French, hated it, and changed to art history, which was just a joy. It was so interesting. And coming to the end of it, I wasn't really sure how I was going to use it. And we got taken to a symposium that the National Gallery held in London called Paintings as Physical Objects. And where I'd say spent 3 years looking at paintings very much in terms of stylistic development, or maybe feminist art history, suddenly this symposium introduced the idea of artworks in terms of their ingredients. So suddenly that portrait of a woman was a layer of ground up pigments in an oil medium on a cloth stretched around a wooden structure. And also talking about all the analytical techniques, X-ray, infrared, so techniques that allow you to see below the surface and start to sense how something's been built up. And it absolutely blew me away. And that was my light bulb moment. And I was like, that's what I'm going to do. And then, but my training, I got into the courthold, which required submitting a portfolio. You had to really show a high level of attention to detail and manual skills. And although I had the art history degree, I had to go back to school and do GCSE chemistry to demonstrate at least a competence in that kind of science. You need a reasonable understanding so that you can read things like safety data sheets and grasp the chemistry that underscores conservation, even if you don't have a degree in it. But it was all Old Master at that point. And then my initial internship was Old Master in Holland, working on 17th century Dutch paintings. And then fast forward, I got a job in Dublin at a gallery that acquires modern and contemporary art, the Hugh Lane Gallery, which has the Bacon Studio. And one of the first big shows we did was a contemporary artist called Patrick Scott, and everything was raw canvas, gold leaf, synthetic modern paints, and it had been hanging in private houses over peat fires, water stains, and it was so different, and it was like a very steep learning curve, and emailing like the Guggenheim and MoMA for suggestions and tips on how to deal with these things, because you couldn't possibly touch them with solvents or water in the way that you would a traditional painting. And then gradually I worked at the gallery for 13 years, and over that time we led works worldwide. We were constantly talking to living artists, and it was such an enjoyable process, that very dynamic dialogue with people who are very strongly opinionated about their work and are needed to guide what you do to it. You can't, it's so non-traditional. Each artwork is so specific that you really need to involve the creator of it. So that was my path in, really.
Did you sometimes find that the creator wasn't as aware of the materials as you were on one level? They were aware of how they work with them, but maybe they weren't aware of what chemically or what physically they were made. Did you ever find that they were slightly ignorant of the chemistry and physical makeup of the material, or were they always very aware of that?
I think it varies. Younger artists, from my experience, certainly seem to be taught relatively little about technique, whereas, say, in more traditional training, certainly maybe even in the 50s and 60s, people were taught to build a picture, how to prime a canvas, how to stretch it, size it. Whereas now there seems to be a lot of emphasis on even things like branding and how you promote yourself, manage your career, how you are. I quite often hear this expression, intellectually rigorous, being intellectually rigorous about your work. So being able to discuss your work, but often there's a lot of potential in that when you start to work with an artist, you can say, well, that PVA you used, did you realize there was a more stable alternative?
Exactly.
And sometimes they're interested and other times they're not, and you work with what you get, basically.
Absolutely. And the education and qualifications were they similar to Claire's?
I guess so. I mean, do you mean to get into?
Yeah. How did you then have to guide your education to? I suppose you pretty much already said how you got there. So
an internship in Holland, which was
yes,
and then actually I did go into a job straight after that, and then it was so straight on in. But yes, you're
Yeah.
right. Internships, as Claire said, are really important for young conservators. It's great to be sort of mentored quite closely in the early stages to sort of just build up your confidence as much as anything, I think.
Yeah.
And I was going to thank you, and I was going to ask Claire. I mean, most professions have some kind of professional guild or body behind them, and I think the one, as I understand it, for conservation is ICON, ICON. So, Claire, could you explain what? Can you remember what ICON stands for? Could you tell us about ICON as an organisation?
So ICON is the Institute of Conservation based in the UK.
Yeah.
There's also the International Institute of Conservation, which is also based in the UK. But ICON is a professional membership body for not just conservators, but anybody who is working in the conservation of cultural, historic, heritage art. And it's also a charity, so it is to raise the profile of conservation, to educate the public. And it runs apprenticeships, actually they're started, so maybe that's along the same lines of internships. And we're both accredited, aren't we?
Yeah.
So accreditation, is that something you want to say something about?
Yeah, sure. It's something that's more conservators are increasingly doing. I don't know, when did the accreditation come in? I'm not sure. It's 20 years ago, was it?
Yeah, just over 20 years.
Right. So basically it's like a peer reviewed, you can apply from 5 years after qualifying. And you have to submit a portfolio of 5 or 6 complex projects, complex being defined as where you're marshalling a wide range of resources, or there are several potential outcomes, or several potential routes a treatment might take, including doing nothing, all of which have quite different outcomes. So where you'd have to use a high degree of judgment as to which is the best decision for the situation. So projects that demonstrate that kind of complexity and high level of skill. So you submit those and they have to tick off 37 professional standards in all areas of assessing an object, providing options, carrying out conservation treatments, documenting everything, and then judgment and ethics, things like that, and CPD. And then basically the assessment day is a full day where you get 2 assessors come to your studio and grill you. Well, they're very nice, they grill you very nicely.
They are, but
but it's a tough
institute,
and they're looking for clear evidence of every single one of those standards to pass, and you have to meet proficient, which is like there's like competent, novice, competent, proficient, expert. You have to get proficient in all. So by the end of it, you need
therapy.
You need therapy that day. Yeah, it's a very tiring day, but it's yeah. So if you get through that, it's like getting, I suppose, chartered exams.
Well, ICON are thinking at some point about getting a chartership.
Oh yeah, right.
So it is equivalent. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that sort of level of achievement, and it's basically just, I suppose, it's quality control. Really.
Yeah, so if you're using a accredited conservator, you know that they've got all the skills, experience, they keep their training up to date, and they've proved that they can make ethical decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and presumably there's a website that listeners can look up and find out more about ICON themselves, but presumably it has a members only area where you have to log in. But what I was going to ask you is, on the public's site, which I assume it has, is there a code of ethics there that listeners could read about? And what is there?
There's a code of conduct.
Yeah.
Code of conduct.
And there's loads of actually really helpful information about how to look after all different materials.
Yeah, and the ethics of that.
Yes, it's got around silver, how to clean the silver properly, and then it always would end with saying, you know, consult a conservator.
Yeah.
And well, while we're talking about ethics and conservation, maybe Joe can start with this first. Maybe you could talk about, from my experience, it sounds like it's changed a lot. So when I first went to the British Museum, I would look at like an ancient Greek vase, and you know, you could see most Greek vases, as you know, ancient Greek vases, as you know, are found in archaeology, shattered, and you can, if you look close, you don't have to look that closely to see it's being put back together again like a jigsaw. And as I understand it, they used to use like glues that we now realise are actually very bad for the future of the object and so on. Whereas now, and the other thing I used to notice about Greek vases is there was a tendency when I first looked at them to complete, if the painting had come off, like the famous black figure, that sometimes is missing or colours are missing. they would, the conservators or restorers, we might call them, would actually repaint it so the whole thing looks pristine as possible. Whereas nowadays, the same vase, I'm thinking about one in the British Museum, the Soho Dinos crater. The Dinos on a stand is quite famous, early black figure. The first ever signed work in the history of art. It's actually got Sophos Vengrafson on it, which is Sophos painted in its early 6th century. And that, as far as I know, that's the earliest ever signature. But now it has these orange areas, which is the oxidized background of the clay with the black figures on. But anything that's missing, they just put the orange in. So it doesn't look as aesthetically pleasing, but it does show us what has been conserved and what's original. So, I mean, in your opinion, maybe with contemporary art, has conservation, the ethics of conservation, has that changed since you first started working?
Has it changed? I think the principles I was taught when I was training hold up. The main principles are, for example, I mean, the intent, the artist's intent. What is this object supposed to look like? How is it made? Understanding its materials and techniques in detail. Intervening as little as possible to make something stable and presentable, and really importantly, making it reversible, documenting what you do and making it as reversible as possible. Now, that's not always achievable. So if you want to introduce an adhesive and it's going to run into the structure, realistically, you aren't going to get all of that out. But where possible, you might then choose an adhesive that's maybe already present in the object to some extent. So it's not going to interfere or cause harm. But you try to make something reversible in reasonably gentle, simple, using gentle, simple methods. Partly because it's quite possible down the line that there'll be a better way of doing it, or it will have aged badly and somebody might want to replace what you're doing. But yeah, I mean, how has it changed? I suppose the thing that changes is that some conservation can be a bit subject to trends at times. So back in the days, there was a big vogue for lining paintings because it would sort of set them up really well for the future. And now lining is known to be a very invasive process. So it would be done in extreme situations, not as a routine measure. So I think people are hopefully a bit more cautious about intervening. I had a boss years ago who said, actually, we'll be the generation known for doing nothing, because we do err on the side of caution a lot more, I think.
It's sound, yeah, clear.
Yeah, I think so, because I suppose there's as a profession, we're still quite young and developing, and I think that's what's interesting about it as well, is that there's conferences all the time where people are still talking about ethics and approaches, and there's new ways of doing things. And so I suppose that's part of accreditation, isn't it? We're always learning, we're always updating our knowledge. So we are still learning, and we sort of are the generation that Nyar came in the 60s and isn't this brilliant and it's smooth all over everything, and then it cross-links and you can't get it off. So I think we've sort of had those lessons of to be careful. And actually, my whole job, what I do is assessing and managing risk. So you don't want to be part of the risk. So yeah, and then I think ethics as well, it's, you're talking about the artist still being alive, and that's an issue that I don't have quite often. But I do have clients, and they will have different views on what they want their object to or their collection to look like. So I spent the first 15 years of my career in the National Trust English Heritage. So historic house organisations that preserve historic houses as they kind of were, sort of, in time, and they do a lot for public engagement and interpretation. That's all great, but things are left as they are, and that is the original surface, and that's the surface you're with. And then I started working for people that had their own collections, and they wanted to look shiny. It's gold. I wanted to look goldy and beautiful again. So you're constantly, in every case, having to assess sort of the ethics of what you're doing and how you're interacting, and yeah.
I mean, I think in the art market, there are some, I'm not going to name any names, but there are some people like dealing with old masters and classic modern work, which is now already quite old, whose collectors want the thing to look pristine. So as I understand it, they will often do things with it that are actually really bad for in 20, I've heard other conservators say that in 25 years, by using this thing that makes it look like a pristine old master, it'll probably deteriorate at a certain point. I don't know how true that is, but they're often doing some things, as you say, which are actually really quite harmful in the long term to the work, just to sell it, if you like. You tend to see that maybe more in the art market, and I do think there's a bit of a division there that, as I understand it now, when I go to the British Museum and look at their conservation ethics and read their conservation reports, they're really very careful, you say, not to intrude into the object as little as possible, so that to preserve it. That's one of the ICOM ethical codes, the International Council of Museums, I've noticed, is that to preserve for future generations, to make sure it's still there for future generations. But one of the things that strikes me about what both of you have said is it's very similar to developments in medical surgery, where surgeons now, they used to take the bone, they used to be intrusive and do an operation. Now, if they don't have to do that, they won't. And that it's quite interesting, the ethics of surgery, where they're saying, oh, it's better just to leave that. And they never used to say that. The surgeons couldn't wait to get their hands on people, and I think that's something.
Didn't they used to give people as a 21st birthday present, you get all your teeth pulled out and there's a new set? And I always think that's, nobody would dream of doing it.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, or now I know, I couldn't work out why I have so many fillings. And now, historically, apparently, it was NHS. The dentists were getting a lot of money for every filling they gave the kid. So you'd have these horrible injections that used to really hurt then. And now I know that probably none of them were actually decayed. That's quite well known now. So coming back to the Soho vase in the British Museum, which is the first signature. The signature itself is quite interesting, I think, for a conservator, because it says Soho painted me. And I often say to my students, that's the vase speaking to the viewer. It's not like Vincent on the corner. Vincent is the painter. It's actually reflexive, saying, painter me. And I say, I think conservators, they kind of, you handle this object as though it's a living human being, and that can be an approach to the object. Almost, I don't know if that's ever come through your mind, that you're almost dealing with an organic living thing when you're working.
Also, there's a word for it, isn't there? But sometimes you end up talking to things and you think that's really that's really hard.
Madness.
You okay? It's not mine. No, do you ever do that?
You get very fond of things. There's certain works when they leave the studio, it's really, you feel quite really sad to see them go, because they're really gorgeous to have around.
As do artists.
You're very pleased to see the back of
This problem, obviously, but we do maybe with the owners of art who might have to sell it at auction because they need some liquid cash in a country house. But I know that artists I've spoken to, they often have a work that they really just don't want to sell because they just like it themselves or the family likes it.
Right.
So thank you for that. So Claire, can you explain what's meant by preventive conservation and maybe give some examples from your own experience? For example, maybe your recent work with Stonehenge, which I know you've been working with in the new interpretation of Stonehenge.
Yeah. So it's interesting you talked about medicine earlier, because quite often conservation and medicine are compared. So preventive conservation is managing the risks, the agents of deterioration, we call them, that can lead to deterioration or damage of an object. So things fading in light, being eaten by insects, getting too damp and going mouldy. So just kind of like preventive medicine with the people that, exercise, drink lots of water, eat well, and then you'll be healthier for longer. And it's not mutually exclusive instead of interventive conservation. They kind of work together and they do overlap. So that's kind of going to, it's just managing risks, and we can't preserve everything forever. We kind of have to admit that. But it's about slowing down deterioration and keeping things sort of in good condition as long as we can. So I'm just trying to think of some examples. So Stonehenge, actually, so that's when I worked at Freedom Heritage, and I was the conservator that helped put the Stonehenge Visitor Centre together. I'm just trying to think, but that was, in some ways, that was sort of helped by the fact that some of those materials were really, really old. So stone and flint, they've been around for a long time. And they were kind of easy to look after, as opposed to modern plastics and different ball games. So it was more about trying to mount things so they were very visible to the public. And we had bits of gold to make sure they were secure. The first exhibition actually was an amazing exhibition, lots of manuscripts. So we had to have display cases that controlled the temperature, relative humidity, light levels. Yeah, I think that's probably.
I remember an earlier conservation lecturer that you probably know, rest in peace, Bob Child.
Yeah.
He used to come and lecture to us, what character, rather politically incorrect, I'm sure you won't mind me saying. I don't know whether you remember that, but he did an exercise with our students. He'd give them a piece of paper that we had a handout, and he would have different materials like stone, flints, plastic, glass, etc. And he then had another column with saying, can you drop this? What temperature range do you think this will suffer? So he would say one by one, well, I've got a piece of flint or stone. If I drop it, will it smash? Might do, you know, but less likely to maybe than a piece of glass. And then he always ended up in his jokey way with a human being. You know, if you drop your little sister, from what height can you drop them from before they break something or hurt them? You know, and what sort of temperature range can we tolerate? Which is actually really interesting, really scary when you read that with human beings. It's a very narrow range, I understand, you know, compared to some of the materials that like you're working with. But I'm sure that I think there's going to be other examples from Claire's experience. Obviously, we'll come to it a bit later on. But so Jo, maybe you can explain how your work maybe is similar to Claire. You're working mainly with contemporary work. What is similar maybe to Claire working with older objects, heritage objects, and maybe how it might differ, and again give some examples of particular problems you encounter maybe working with contemporary art. You've already done that to a certain extent, but you might want to talk with Claire about similarities and differences in your practices.
Well, I suppose, like you, we do quite a lot of risk assessment. So, for example, a good example might be a few years ago, we had a couple of painted wooden sculptures that ended up in frieze. We worked on them for frieze, and they were really beautiful little works, but very, very fragile indeed. And if they had been knocked off their plinths, they would have smashed without a doubt. And so I straight away you could see, right, but having examined them, this is clearly a risk. So speaking to the client, how are you planning to display these? And they was sort of described a situation where they would be on plinths with, you know, what frieze are like, people walking around everywhere.
So you're thinking about the audience. And
absolutely. Knowing where they would end up, taking responsibility for that situation, because you're in a position to point out the risk. You can see it's going to be a risk. So I said, well, would you consider covered plinths? No, couldn't do that. No, they need to be exposed. Right, would you realise that this is, you know, they do get knocked off, which is quite a significant possibility in an environment like that. Anyway, they categorically would not. So we devised a way of very discreetly securing them to reduce that risk. So as an add-on to the treatment we had carried out, cleaning and stabilising them for display, we also made the risk of them getting damaged on display a lot less. And in the event, they were so exposed, I'm amazed they didn't get damaged, but we did as much as we could. And again, it was sort of having to communicate with people in different countries with completely different remits and interest in what was being achieved. You know, some people with much more commercial focus, us with more risk averse focus. But on a daily basis, we often we fit a lot of backboards to paintings. That's a very common way to improve protection and insulate them better. And just things like, so we have a really large painting studio at the moment, which is very awkward to carry and lift because it's enormous and very heavy. Yeah, it's very big and heavy, and we could see that people had been gripping the edges and pressing on the canvas, which is, you know, causing dents.
Yes.
So we fitted very simple fabric webbing and straps on the back that allow you to pick it up with very little contact with the edges, and so straight away it's not going to get handling damage in the same way. And it's just something we said to the client, would you consider this? And they're like, oh yeah, great, do that, that'd be nice. And they just tuck behind the painting when it's on display. So just simple things like that would make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to those wooden sculptures, would you call them? So you're trying to please the the artist and the gallery in terms of presenting these potentially for sale
Yeah.
to a collector. So they've got to look aesthetic,
Yeah.
and so you're also there trying to make a decision about how do you stabilize this and deter risk, potential risk with somewhere like Frieze, where there's thousands of people walking around and crowded. But also how do you make them look attractive, you know, to the viewer? So that's quite a difficult balance sometimes. And again, you maybe need to speak to the artist or their representative, find what are you going to be okay with this?
Exactly, that's exactly what we did. So we were having conversations with the artist, conversations with the gallery, and they were the main two stakeholders in that treatment. So yeah, one guiding the aesthetics and the other sort of discussing what they were prepared to pay for. But
Yeah, and I guess because it's contemporary, in my mind, you know, you're kind of thinking, well, it can't be damaged because it's new.
yeah, that's a common.
Whereas with you, in your mind, obviously, you're constantly. I think the public are more aware when they go into like an English country house. A lot of this stuff is fragile, and you know the kids might go running up and try and touch something. You have to tell them why you can't do that. But I think most people probably realise it's a bit more fragile. Where with contemporary art, maybe they're not so aware of that.
Sorry, I mean, gosh, what we had Joss Dickburn in one canvas. That had to be fixed. Tomatoes, somebody had clearly been eating quite vigorously in front of one of the paintings, and it had like literally plots of tomato seeds splashed on it. That was another one.
And then you have to also check that wasn't the original artist's materials.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It really was clearly not. We had that painting that just mended a tear in a painting that was opened using a box cutter. That slashed a great tear in the middle. What else have we had? Lots of things, and also just the main thing with contemporary art is it can't tolerate a scratch or a knot. It's so visible on something that's meant to be a uniform, pristine, matte, colourful surface. There's no detail often to disguise these damages, so they're disproportionately visible and distracting. So yeah, also and they're difficult to clean a lot of the time. Anything will get dirty if you leave it in an exposed environment.
Absolutely. I remember actually at Sotheby's Bond Street there was a contemporary art sale, post-war contemporary art sale, and I remember they showed us it was a Basquiat, and unframed as they often are, and the specialist pointed out, look, if you look around the sides of the canvas on the edges, you know, it's white or primed white. You can see these sort of dirty finger and thumb marks. And we had to kind of try and work, you know, we were trying to work out, have we got Basquiat's fingerprints? Was he ever in jail? You know, could we contact the New York Police Department? You know, because it's very important to us. If these are handlers' fingerprints, then a conservator might say ethically we should remove them. But if they're Basquiat's, the artists, they have an interest in themselves. And another, just, I mean, you might want to comment on that, but just another thing when I think about it at the auction house. I remember a specialist once picking up this Fontana, you know, slice painting. You probably both know those, where he primes and stretches the canvas, and 6 months later he takes a razor blade in nanoseconds, cuts through it, and that's the work of art. And this person picked up the painting that wasn't framed again. They usually aren't, the Fontanas, without white handling gloves on. And I remember some of my logistics colleagues because we did an MA in logistics, I actually put a picture of this on Instagram, and I got a lot of quite aggressive responses saying, where are the white gloves?
Oh, yeah.
And in the end I had to take the post down. But I remember being in the Van Gogh Museum I took the students there for a lunch break, and the Conservators were talking about, it was the Hockney exhibition was on, and they were talking about handling. You know, they were the curators, installers, and they were saying the paint hadn't dried, and then we were, and I said, what about, would gloves help? They said, no, it would have damaged it more. So it then introduced us this idea of, I don't know what, I'd just like your views on this. So maybe Claire, with like an old master, should you, or the all kind of heritage objects, should you use gloves?
So Conservators can talk about gloves for hours.
Yes.
Like in the pub, talking about gloves.
So great at parties.
But there are materials that it's better not to. So if we're handling metals, anything gilded, we would always wear. So we don't wear white cotton gloves. That just seems to be a thing that people like in photographs. But usually nitrile gloves, or sort of some alternative that's more environmentally friendly. Just we want to stop the oils from our hands getting on, causing corrosion. There's some great photos of people that handled metals, and you can see their fingerprints now corroded in the metal surface. So we'd wear gloves for that. Some people for ceramics won't wear gloves if there isn't gilding, because they feel they get a better grip. For things like paper, books, manuscripts, quite often people wash their hands and then handle them, so they've got more manual dexterity, so you're not trying to sort of grab at things. So, but I know that I've spoken to colleagues at places like the British Library, and they've been on programmes, and people have written in saying, how dare you handle things without gloves. So it's sort of built into this public perception now that you should wear white gloves to handle things, but it's not always the case. So for heritage.
Yeah, and with contemporary art, I mean, that, as I say, these are examples which caused a huge rumpus and a controversy about, where are the gloves. And I remember then speaking to that specialist, and they said, actually, that they didn't feel as though they were doing any damage, and it's easier to hold, because these things can slip out of your hands and do more damage. There was that kind of I've heard that argument.
But you could say that if you're, I think you're right. I think I see, sometimes you see a transport company sort of show on Instagram something showing how they've done a beautiful job, and you're like, well, why aren't any of you wearing gloves? And it's like, maybe there is a good reason, but if there is, maybe you should say
you
that.
Need to say so,
Definitely.
But also, if you're in and out of a lorry, your hands are going to get dusty. You're often taking stuff from houses where there's dust built, particularly your houses where there's a lot of built up of dust and so on. I mean, we have paintings in the Institute. I remember there used to be a row of paintings up the staircase of building, because these are two houses, 30 that we're in now, and 31 next door, and they're both, rented by the Institute. Condé Nast, I don't know if you noticed, they've now moved in there, so they're in the other building, and so we had to remove these paintings that were contemporary, and they were by a guy called Simon Morley, who used to teach at the Institute in the MA in Fine and Decorative Art, but he did so well as an artist that he's now a working artist still. And he did these paintings, he was commissioned by the Institute earlier to do these paintings for the Institute, and basically each one of them is about this sort of size, and each one is a famous Sotheby's sale catalogue. So it's got the famous 1958 Peter Wilson sale, which was the first televised celebrity black, a dinner suit sale of only 7, impressionist, post-impressionist works, very, very famous. So it's what we believe to be when the auctions became a glamorous occasion, like an evening sale where you go out to dinner. But so that was one of them, the cover of the original catalogue. And they're all different colours. So the Elton John, he was selling off his wardrobe, and he's just been on a Glasgow, of course, on the last stage. It's possibly his final concert, so he might be selling more now, but it was pink. So even the colour choices of these, but sorry, coming back to the conservation thing, I used to notice that there was a lot of really greasy, because we're in the middle of London, greasy dust. And the cleaners had rightly been told not to remove it. And it was there, I shouldn't be saying this, but it was kind of there for a long time. And I used to wonder whether I could bring some kind of very light brush in and just try and brush it off. But then I thought, if it is greasy, like the grime we got on our windowsills under a flight path in London, it could spread the grease. So do you often encounter those? I mean, Claire, you must encounter this all the time where you've got dust that might have grease in it.
So dust removal is huge because it takes time and money. So houses have spent a lot of time removing dust, and it is good to remove dust because it can have pollutants in that can react. It can be hygroscopic. It can, encourage insects to.
So what's hygroscopic?
Also can attract moisture, and then you've got sort of more higher moisture levels on your surface. So it's not great to have on. And then there's been lots of research into dust on objects that at certain humidities it can then turn into dust, and it starts attaching through different ways. So cementation and calcium bonds, it can attach to the object, and then it's hard to remove. So it's good to remove it while it's still dust. But removing dust, or using the wrong thing, so furniture polish, brass, all things like that are really bad. So removing dust incorrectly can cause lots of damage too. And I think I used my lecture the case of some cleaning lady who was given a ceramic as a present, and it could have been worth $1 million, but it's only worth 92,000 because she'd rubbed all the enamel off because she cleaned it so often. So it's about frequency as well. So we spend a lot of time working with people about how often they clean and how they clean things, because the trouble is, if you don't let people clean things, I remember, I won't say where it was, but we had some polychrome stones quite early, and we were really wondering how we could remove the dust from them. And whilst we were doing that, someone thought they're a bit cobwebby and came along with Dyson and just vacuumed them off. So it's that level. It's always just constantly judging the level that's appropriate. So
There are other vacuum cleaners.
there are, sorry.
But I think you work
I'm
here.
rather cleaner.
Yeah, absolutely. So you would have to, as a conservator of, and this is presumably can be true of contemporary art, which gathers dust like Simon Morley's paintings. You'd have to try and work out first what that dust is. I mean, could you remove a little bit and do you have to test? Do you look at it under a microscope? Do you have to test
We do
it?
that. We remove dust and we look under a microscope.
Yeah.
There's something called the particulate atlas.
Yes.
That you can identify where the dust comes from. Because actually, that's quite interesting because some properties we can say, you know, it's your gravel outside. So if you change the gravel, then you have less dust coming in, or it is coming from outside, so you need better matting. Or English Heritage did some work at Apsley House where they realised that the dust levels in windows open was the same as 130 days with the windows shut. So just closing the windows help dust levels. So that's the first line of defence, is trying to stop things become dusty in the first place. So we do, we just done a project up in the north where we removed dust, and we had a vacuum cover with some textile on it, and we then looked everywhere.
It's like they say, if you're trying to find something with your own vacuum cleaner, you put like a nylon over it, and it stops the thing getting sucked up.
Yes, and actually what we found was really useful as well is so I think conservation, we're always borrowing from other industries. So we're talking about the medical, we're looking at medical advances. So for mold control, we're looking at what hospitals are trying to do to keep down sort of mold. And there's a really interesting lecture I went to a few years ago about all this skincare research into collagen. People that look after manuscripts are really interested in that, about how sort of looking after dead skin and alive skin. But we've used some gels that are actually used by forensic police to take fingerprints.
I was going to say, this is beginning to sound like forensics, where you said that it's the gravel outside, you know, you find it on the shoe and that allows you to.
So we use these forensic sheets. I'll give you the details of it. And then we put them on, and there was a poster done at some conference, I think by Dutch Conservator, that they don't leave any residue, so we know it's safe to use. People research, and you can get the dust off that way. So yes, we're always looking at other industries as well and how they're developing, because usually they've got more money for research. So
So dust is actually a really interesting thing.
It's huge, and it's because it takes so much time and money to pay people to remove it that houses are very interested in the best way of doing it.
Yeah, and on a painting, it can really, I often think it's almost like dust on a painting is almost like a hangover on a person. When you get it off, it's like it just comes back to life. But also we find a lot of modern and contemporary works, because they stay soft for so long, you can find that some of the dirt just literally sinks into the paint. If it's, say for example, we had a painting in the studio a few months ago where the artist had painted from the tube, so the paint was really thick, really heavy impasto, and it had clearly taken so long to dry, and it had been left in a very dusty atmosphere in his studio, and we couldn't, and the paint was water sensitive. So when we did our tests, we could see that if we had gone in, it was sort of bonded into the surface of the paint, and the paint was water soluble. So there was no, just the specifics of the painting meant that there was no way to get the dirt off without disturbing the paint. So we had to sort of tell the client, well, really, this is a permanent feature of this painting.
And if you went back to the artist, there's nothing they can do about it, they'd say, presumably.
He's dead, I'm afraid.
Oh.
This is one of the themes, he's a dead one.
Did it help that it was his dust from his studio?
Yeah, in a way, it was authentic dust.
Yeah.
So we could probably
Actually, I just made a note actually earlier on, because you mentioned the Francis Bacon studio in Dublin, which used to, of course, be in Soho, and they moved it when Francis Bacon died. They actually moved so they got archaeologists in, as I understand it,
and conservators. A bunch talking about first job leaving college. It was basically the Hugh Lane were donated. The studio was donated to the Hugh Lane, and a great Irish conservator, Mary McGrath, project managed the conservation of it, and she used to employ us during the holidays. She'd have these amazing projects, large scale projects, and she'd employ like all the second years from the Courtauld. So she basically, there happened to be three of us living together at the time. We were all living in the same house in Islington. And she rang us and said, "Right, we've got this job. You've got to keep it completely to yourselves. It's not we need to just basically three people."
Totally confidential.
Yeah, it's confidential, but you all know how to work together, and I need. So basically, we went in, and the archaeologists did I think it's called a geodetic survey. They mapped the room and did these beautiful elevation drawings of every shelf, the floor plan, and they would say bring a box, like a VAT-69 port box from the studio side of Greece News, in Bacon's old studio apartment. They'd take it from the studio into the living room where the conservation tables had been set up, and we'd work our way through the box from the top item to the bottom, give each one a feature number and a brief description and pack them up for shipping. And we did that over a 2-week period. We got everything out, the whole contents, the ceiling, the floor, and the paint marks on the walls.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And none of us took any photos because it was pre-internet and it didn't occur to us. So there's like no records that we have of this amazing project we took part in.
No film or anything.
There was official photography.
Yes.
It's a really good photography.
But no, you think it would make a great film, wouldn't it? A video moving.
There was official photography and filming done, but what I mean is nowadays we've all been slapping it on our camera phones. Even if we couldn't share it, you'd be like so amazed perhaps at what you were taking part in. But
I didn't realise you'd worked on that project.
I was really lucky. It was an amazing thing to be part of. Yeah, so
then,
July 98, July 98, it was packed up and shipped off.
And then were you part of the installation in Dublin?
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit about how you then reinstalled it?
Oh, it was catalogued over every item. I think there were 7,500 items, and they were catalogued over a 2-year period. Again, with a really great team in Dublin, and the database was made so that allows you to navigate the whole collection. I think that's online. I think you can actually access that online. So that was done over a 2-year period, and then part of the gallery was refurbished and redesigned to house the recreated studio. So the staircase was embedded in the floor, so you could see the entrance process of how you'd have got up to the studio, and then the studio itself was recreated exactly, and we got so the walls and the floor and the ceiling were reinstalled, and then bit by bit all the objects were put back in reverse order, except that anything that was used by him, any source material, and 103 unfinished canvases were retained for the archive and facsimiles put in, so it looks appropriate, it looks the same, but all the original sort of material that he clearly had worked with was retained for scholarship, and that's had a huge impact on Bacon scholarship. There's been any number of exhibitions and books written about it based on that. It's probably the resource for Bacon scholarship, I think.
It's incredible. And just one more question I would ask is, once that is installed in the Hugh Lane studio in Dublin, and you can visit it now. So what are the conservation issues with that? With preserving an artist studio? I mean, what would you advise? What do you have to do, and how often?
Well, the studio is very carefully climate controlled, as is the archive.
Yes, because I haven't been there. Have you been there?
It's really beautiful. It's fascinating. It's a great gallery.
I might go out to the the Fontana, the old master woman artist that's got a major exhibition in Dublin. Might go out there this summer to what's her name, Lavinia Fontana. And then must go and see the Bacon thing. But I get that's kind of so have they got something around it which climate controls it, or it's just
it's an enclosed space, so you can't walk in.
So I see.
You access it by, there's like a kind of a glass cubicle into the doorway, so you can sort of step into just inside the studio, and then a decision was made to use the windows which were on the south end of the room. Were basically made available so that you look into the studio through the windows, although originally they would have been on the first floor. They were just, it was the most, after several different sort of ideas about how it was going to be presented, that was the decision about how, and it works very well, so you get a good sense of of the kind of the chaos of the room, but also the logical. There's actually a sequence and an order to it that is not immediately evident, but he had a sort of a place for things. And
interesting
Yeah.
figure, and then of course famously, and again to do with conservation, as I understand it, his artistic practice was he tended to get very drunk in the Soho pub, and he'd work through the night then in a kind of frenzy, and he'd literally throw things at the with dust and everything. He'd pick up cloths from the floor and throw them at the canvas. And when you look at Bacon today in a gallery, you can actually often see hairs and dust on the paintings, which I assume are from that.
that, I think, yes. but
Unless
he
that's a myth,
also-
maybe that's a myth.
He was a great storyteller, and he didn't let truth stand in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, he was a famous Soho drinker, but he was he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and I've come to, because there's something I want to ask Claire in a moment, but also he famously, when he was a gambler and a drinker, so he'd never had any money, as I understand. When he was younger, he didn't have any money for fresh canvases. I don't know if this is a myth, but he used to turn the canvas around, and on the unprimed canvas, he would paint very spontaneously, which you have to do on the unprimed canvas. And he fell in love so much with that physical process that affected his practice for the rest of his life. That's what makes him so exciting to look at, just the speed in which he's doing these paintings and the spontaneity.
Yeah.
But are there any conservation issues with the unprimed canvas compared to the primed canvas?
It's I suppose potentially it's, if you paint on raw canvas, the oil can degrade it to some extent, but in a way the priming on the back sort of protects it to some extent. His very early works tend to be somewhat fragile because they're so thickly painted. There's a weight in the
canvas,
but that's a good example of his myth making, because that kind of, he even says in an interview, "Oh, I was in Monte Carlo and I'd lost all my money," and but lo and behold, Graham Sutherland had already been painting on the back side of the canvases, and they hung out continuously for a couple of years. They were very, very close friends around that time, and he never mentions that link. He never kind of, according to him, it was all just, serendipitous. So
he's a clever guy, very interesting.
Reusing canvas is quite common.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, reusing canvas is quite common. So there's so the Titians that they found other images, they've turned them, and
and that is a problem of display then, isn't it? And conservation, again, do you remove the layer and find the work underneath? And that's like archaeology, it's going to damage in Pompeii, where I did my research, there's a big issue, of course, because the top layer is actually 2,000 years old as well. So if you dig through that, you're damaging a layer of archaeology to find an earlier period of Pompeii, which is in itself quite interesting. I was going to come to Claire, and I'd like to say something about creepy crawlers, like insects in heritage houses, and
it's huge. So dust is big, and insects take up a lot of our time as well. So we're just coming to the end of moth season. So things like beetles that are in wood, and moths are a huge problem.
Fabric, yes.
So for textiles, anything that's been part of an animal, so silk, fur, feathers, leather to some extent. So usually sort of a couple of months ago we started getting the phone calls that people started seeing webbing, plague moth in their collections. So it sounds really glamorous, isn't it? Dust and bugs. It's what we spend a bit of our time doing. So again, it's all about prevention. It's about keeping spaces clean, making sure that anything comes into a space isn't carrying anything with it. So we do a lot of filming supervision, so we make sure when props come in, they don't have any sort of not bring anything in with them. And then it's just about treating, and we're trying to go down more routes now that aren't insecticides. We're not introducing lots of chemicals. The conservation profession is really trying to be more sustainable in how we approach things. So we'll freeze things or heat them or starve insects of oxygen, basically, to try and get rid of them.
Yeah, I remember at the Sotheby's warehouse where they store work, often for quite long periods of time. You'd be amazed. People forget what they bought. They're that rich, apparently. And they have this, you might have been down there at Greenford, they have this climate controlled area which where the oxygen content is low, so there can't be a fire. It's where all their very precious things are. But also they put stuff in there like carpets to kill off because it's very cold and it kills off some of the insects. Do you have any? I mean, contemporary art. Do you have to think about this?
Yeah, woodworm comes in quite fairly often because it's modern and contemporary. So I suppose the earliest stuff we tend to deal with is maybe 1940, but mould is really common. You mentioned that earlier, and that's catastrophic. It can be
even
so
very recent.
Oh yeah, we had a beautiful little painting came in a few years ago on vellum that had been in a leak, under a leak, and it had grown a beard like crazy, and then the mould had grown for so long that it had caused black mold stains, and it was so embedded, and it can be impossible to get that out without, the kinds of things that would maybe reduce the staining are harmful to the artwork. So yeah, we've seen pests a few times, and I think you've got something I worked on for a public institution. So Claire is one of the go-to and also there's a really great contact in the west of Ireland, Lesser College. They've had a lot of experience of dealing with bugs, and there's a heat treating method where these huge fans that come to your facility and they can take in objects as large as say a canoe or something really quite big and gradually raise the temperature up and maintain it for a very long time until the pest is killed basically. So but it can be a difficult issue depending on what the object can tolerate. Some objects can't tolerate extreme cold or heat or the kind of heat needed to kill the vermin.
Presumably there's a lot of research papers that have experimented with materials that you can turn to see what it will take. Is that the way you might work?
I would work with an expert basically because you can't have all the expertise, and it makes more sense to talk to someone who deals with it routinely, who can give you good advice.
So there's a kind of overlap between the contemporary conservator and the heritage conservator. You're often working with similar. I was thinking actually when you were talking about those kind of organic materials, that the Wellcome Gallery in the British Museum with all the folk carts, you might call it, of different materials hanging there. It's fascinating, all the different materials. I don't know if you know that gallery and walk through, but I think through your eyes you must be looking at it thinking that's interesting if you're a conservator at the British Museum. But what I was going to say actually is, do public, not-for-profit, publicly funded museums and galleries, do they have their own? Because I think both of you work both for non-profit and for profit and private individuals who own heritage English country houses. Some of them are National Trust. We didn't explain what that was, but the charitable organisation that's publicly funded to a certain extent, whereas there's a lot of English country houses that are still owned by the Duke and Duchess of, and they have to be open for the public for inheritance tax reasons, and then you've got the public coming in. But both of you, I think, are working in both sectors, the private and the. What I was going to ask you both is, do you ever work for a commercial gallery that might put pressure on you? I was talking about this earlier, to do something you really don't want to do, to make it look better, to sell, or don't you tend to work with dealers who might put pressure on you?
I think so. I think because I came from such a kind of purist, everything is pristine, keep all original material. Dealing with clients who it is their object and it's a functional object. It might be in their family for 300 years, but it's the chair they sit on to have dinner. And then sort of taste comes in that they will say, you want to upholster it, you want to change it. And then it's just about documentation, isn't it? But so there's actually, I think, I've been told there's more houses in private ownership than there is in the National Trust and English Heritage combined. So there's lots of private houses.
And that's the HHA, very often the Historic Houses Association.
And some of them are open to the public because they've given objects in their tax. In that scheme, but I think there's lots that aren't open to the public and very rarely seen. But then it's their object, and their house is listed, so they can't. There's sort of listed building consent what they can and can't do with it. If they've given an object in their tax, then they're certain, they have to look after it. But if it's their object, then it's their object to kind of do with as they want. So then it's sort of just saying, that's interacting, and that is sort of, can we keep the original material underneath? Can we photograph it? Can we document it? So it's just kind of guiding that process to be as
And they own it, so they have a right to say what they do with
They
it.
could put it on the bonfire if they wanted to.
Yeah. But I guess if they're smart, they're going to bring someone like you in, and you might do an assessment of every room in the house and say, actually, I would put shutters on that window because the youth. Are you ever asked to do that kind of assessment of the
So
whole
we do
house?
collections care plans,
Yeah.
and we just started talking to insurance companies now as well, who are saying, can you come and advise so they can look after
That's
their
interesting.
artworks to, keep them as good condition as
Yes, and if they don't stick to that, we're not going to pay out insurance if the thing deteriorates.
Because I'd like to think they'd say that we'd letter their insurance premium looking after them, but maybe I'm being a bit naive. But yeah, but actually it's an investment, so it's not just the significance or the heritage, but it's actually a valuable object that they want to stay as valuable as possible.
I remember one of the slides Bob used to show was a wax object. I just can't remember what it was, but I think it was a piece of folk art made of wax, like a doll or something. It was a doll, that's right, a wax doll, Victorian wax doll. And he showed it as it was, and then he said they put it in this kind of gallery in front of a window that got the afternoon sun. And then they came in one afternoon and it showed the photograph. It was like an ice cream cone that melted. But I was going to ask Steve, maybe start with Joe. I don't know if you can think of an example of something really, you don't have to say who it is or where it is, but of something that is really your worst, the worst subject you've ever seen in terms of being a conservationist, in terms of the way it was displayed, or where it's something similar has happened. I don't know if you could think of an example.
Well, there's lots. Well, yes,
like hanging a painting over a fireplace.
We had a painting come in 3 years ago, I think it was, and it had been hung. The client insisted on hanging it over a radiator, and the stretcher warped so dramatically it punched the frame out. It like punched a foot-long piece of the frame moulding out. So we worked out what was going on. We restored the painting, sent it back, and said, "Could you please choose a different location?" And it's straight back where it was. So if and it's things like that you can't really, as you've said. If it's owned by somebody, you can only advise.
And then they just say, "Oh,
yeah." We worked with someone who thought, wouldn't it be nice if you can lie in the bath and look at a painting? So there's several voluntary.
Wallace Ketchum, the Titian and Perseus and Andromeda, apparently he kept it in his bath, which is why that surface has deteriorated as it has.
It's not ideal. No.
But I guess in some surfaces, some materials would be okay, maybe in a humid, warm atmosphere. I guess, isn't it the changes that, like with wood, it's the fluctuations which are problematic. Hence climate control in a modern museum.
Ideally, but even we're relaxing that now, because I think that we've gone for this kind of 50 to 65%, and it came from sort of best guesses in sort of mid-20th century, and now people are really questioning why we're spending a lot of energy and a lot of money trying to control the environment quite so tightly, and it's not actually, as you say, applicable for all materials. So I think the Arts Council reviewing for government indemnity their environmental parameters at the moment. Loaning institutions are being asked to be more flexible, so you do need to control the environment, but we're trying to do it in a more informed, pragmatic way, so we're not using lots and lots of energy to create.
So this is about sustainability as well, because I don't remember the Rubens Master of the Innocents that used to be the world record auction for an old master. Sotheby's sold, I think, in the early millennium. Lord Thompson of Clee, who was from Canada, and then he lent it to the National Gallery. But one of the reasons, as I understand it, it sold for so much was experts could see from the brushstrokes it was all Rubens, because he often worked, as you know, with his workshop. B, apparently it had been in a rather damp but quite dark nunnery somewhere in Europe for over about 150 years, and they said that the conditions were absolutely perfect. They just left it alone. Didn't bring conservators in, it was very stable, and that's an example of sometimes just leaving something in the right environment. I'm just thinking of those dark churches in Sicily, and where things seem to not be conserved, but they look all right to my eyes on the surface, and so sometimes it's better just to leave well alone.
Sometimes it's but light is a tough one, because you need light to see things. But
Pompeii's a good example where the early excavators didn't seem to realise that if you don't cover it from the sun, and I've been looking at all these wall paintings in my research, and they were there like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and now they're no longer there, because you can see maybe a shaft of light is just getting through, and it's certain part of the fresco is just gone.
Yeah.
It's just that UV.
And you can't get it back. So
Yeah.
it's, it's a UV and visible light. I mean, we can cut the UV out quite easily, but visible light is still damaging. And
And I think ancient authors, like if someone like Vitruvius actually realised that, you know, when he's talking about frescoes, the architect that he talks about frescoes, he actually realised that, you know, you've got to keep this away from the light. And I think he said something strange like moonlight, so they didn't quite get what it was. But presumably moonlight doesn't have UV. Oh, there's a good one.
Yeah, like sometimes I don't know what places
Adapt.
open overnight, but a lot of the political conservation is kind of like political conservation is very modern scientific analysis and informing what we do. But a lot of it, we find that you know, Henry Lloyd's done a lot of work. So I'm looking through housekeepers' manuals, and they would go around following the sun and close the shutters because they didn't want the light on your objects, and silk upholstered furniture would be sent with covers. You know, I think there's a Jane Austen book where they say that this is so important, they even took the case covers off the silk furniture. So they did look after stuff, and things that we've just sort of lost.
They just understood that was the way. Sometimes you just lose those old methods, I guess.
That's why things are so expensive. Things are so disposable now. People maybe don't think about maintaining things.
Yeah.
Some things.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Jo actually, while we're talking about materials, and you talked about the insects and dust.
Yeah.
But I was going to ask Jo about, you know, contemporary artists notoriously like to play with new materials, and that's part of their practice and their philosophical process, if you like, stretching materials and so on. I'm thinking of someone like Damien Hirst, who uses household paint, and you know, quite often students say, surely that's not gonna, you know, you have to repaint. This is household paint. We know you have to paint it after enough, repaint it. So what would happen to something like that if you had a Hirst where he's using household paints rather than conservation standard paints?
Well, a lot of contemporary artists use non-traditional paints, and even amongst, so for example, acrylic is a really common general paint type, but even within that there are many different varieties, and one brand's acrylic paint will behave completely differently to another. There's no getting away from it. That a lot of modern paints are quite fragile. They are quite light sensitive. They're very prone to dirt pickup. They're relatively soft films. You just have to try to, again, this is where preventive conservation comes in, and it's so important, you know, how you handle a work, how you pack it. Packing is a terrible one. And I find that you were saying about, do galleries put pressure on me to do things that I don't want? What often happens is they're very reluctant to spend money on things like transport and packing, because it's like, oh, that's an awful lot of money. And you think it's, you know, spending, I don't know, a couple of £100 on a transit frame is considered an unacceptable expense.
And then even with very wealthy people at Sotheby's, we're told by that their logistics company says, I want the cheapest method.
Yeah,
having spent millions on a work.
Yeah, so for example, a job I did a few years ago, it really struck me. This painting had been sold by a gallery in Europe to a huge gallery in London. Had already been sold, as far as I know, and it was shipped in about 30 quid's worth of polythene and cardboard. And when it was opened at the other end, with all this expectation and, you know, everyone expecting to just receive this thing, it had horrifically stuck to its polythene, and which began a series of panic-stricken phone calls. Could anything be done? Would it show? Would the treatment be visible? It was salvageable, but by the time they had finished paying viewing room fees, so it had to be viewed by various different people at the warehouse multiple times, quotes provided. I think by the time they had finished, it was probably about £10,000 at least.
So the saving on the transport.
And not to mention reputational damage and all the rest.
And the insurers coming in and saying we're not paying the insurance.
I wasn't party to that part of it, but I remember just thinking, my goodness, it was, you know, looking penny pinching, and then the consequences of that were huge. And a lot of people sort of, you know, go straight for the bubble wrap, and if it marks the surface, you get these horrible circular marks. And they can be very difficult to treat, or impossible, or simply beyond the value of the work or what someone's prepared to pay. And
highly unsustainable, of course, bubble wrap. Actually, the last podcast I did, which I haven't published yet, was Mithra Stevens, who did our logistics MA, and she won this. We have this entrepreneurial prize now, which gives a lot of money, like several tens of thousands of dollars for startups. She won it, and she works for Rockbots that have developed these sustainable crates, reusable crates. So her podcast talks a little bit about materials used in logistics, which is what they learnt about. Obviously, one of the main things
I think that's going to be a big area. I hope it is, because I regularly visit a particular transport company, and I think, like many others, every few weeks you just see a huge industrial sized skip full of painting crates. And I remember when I worked in museums, you would have these crates made at huge expense that only fit that painting. And I used for 4 months to get them to and from a show, and then they're thrown away. And
because to store them is so difficult for a gallery or for someone in their own house.
There used to be a company called Conservators who rented them, who I used a lot back in the day. They were lovely, but they folded for about, I think they just basically decided to finish. They've been in business for a long time, and I believe their stock was bought up by other transport companies who are intending to do the same. And I really hope that goes ahead, because what they used to do was simply refit the interior. So they would change the foam or add or take away, but the basic crate stayed the same. And it's a really good system. It's really good.
But you do need somewhere with warehouse space to store all that as well, and then you have to get it to the person and back again.
Of course,
Anyway, I'm aware of the time now, so I'd just like to thank. It's gone quickly, isn't it? It always does. And I suddenly realised, goodness, it's meant to be an hour, and I told people an hour, and it's like, and the listeners, I don't know if you listen to podcasts, but I don't really mind if you suddenly realise an hour and a quarter has gone by and you've been doing the washing up or lying in the bath, and it's, but I hope that I think I'm pretty certain the listeners will find this really interesting and intriguing. So I'd just like to thank Jo Shepard and Claire Fry for contributing to this episode, and hope everyone finds it interesting. I'll ask you for some links to put on the website so people can find your companies and so on, and maybe some other things we've spoken about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I'm just going to switch off. For those of you who wondered why I was talking about different formats, because the YouTube version of this, we're actually sitting in a room rather than on Zoom. So you might want to have a look at us at some point. Just going to switch this